So today we're going to talk about designing images for linocut prints. This is something that I get asked about from time to time, and I really wanted to be able to go in depth with you around a number of different things that you need to be able to do to design successful linocut images. And I'm also going to take you through an example from my own work for a print that I'm currently designing. So the first thing to talk about is design for single layer prints. So this is when you have a linocut block, you print it onto a piece of paper, and that is the finished product. You have made basically a basic stamp, it prints down, that is the image. I think there are two ways to think about single layer linocut prints. The first is to think about them in terms of pattern. I'm going to show you some examples. I will put as much as I can references to who made the different prints that I'm using as examples in the description below. So if you're interested in seeing more of these people's work, do have a look at the links and give those people a follow. Pattern works really well for single layer prints because you can get a really clean, crisp image and it reads really well to the eye. A lot of people seem to use kind of floral-like patterns, repeating patterns. Patterns work really well for single layer prints because you get a nice, clean, crisp, readable image. There is no need to go into tonality usually in a pattern. It can read as a flat layer and still be detailed and intricate and engaging to the eye. The other way to think about single layer linocut prints is to think about them in terms of a graphic image. So an image that makes use of only one color, often black, and the white of the page, and has descriptive lines and kind of shading to create tonality and to create a more illustrative style image. This can be quite tricky with linocut because instead of drawing in the black, you're taking the light away. So something like cross-hatching, for example, is really hard to achieve in the traditional sense because you are not building up dark, you are building up light, and that feels quite different to look at. It's perfectly possible to make a graphic image using a single tone in linocut, but it is a little bit more complex than just drawing straight on a sheet of paper. If we move into reduction or multi-block prints where you are laying down different layers of linocut prints, either by carving away at the same block or by using different blocks, that creates more complexity that you can play with when you're designing. So firstly, with a multi-block print or a reduction print, you can still create pattern and you can use color as accent colors within the pattern. Usually when people do this, they use a dark color like black and then a highly saturated accent color like a vibrant red. There are obviously many ways to do this, but that seems to be quite visually effective to do two quite vibrant, quite equally readable hues or multiples, although I definitely have seen it mostly with two different colors. So then you're talking about having the color of the paper, generally white, the color that is the primary color of the pattern, probably black, but maybe not, and then an accent color such as a vibrant red. If you're looking to create more illustrative work, getting into doing multi-blocks or reduction prints means that you can play with tonality a lot more. And you can make something that actually looks almost like a painting in terms of complexity. So what this means is you're going to pick colors that have different values and that will create tonality that will enable you to depict like the light and dark of a form much easier than if you're using a single layer print. So for example, you might pick to make an image that has black as the darkest color, and then you would pick a mid-tone such as a gray or something else that was in the middle, and then you would have the white of the paper if you're doing two layers. So you're playing with three tones when you have two layers. You can increase that as much as you want to. You could do a monochrome image, so you could start with a dark blue, and then you could have a variety of blues going lighter and lighter towards the white of the paper. And you can build up form and shape doing that. Okay, so I'm going to show you an image that I'm currently designing for a lino print that I'm going to be making soon. And this will give you some ideas about how I use these principles in my own work and how you can apply them to the work that you're currently making. So this is the design I'm currently working with. Now, in terms of color and tonality, what I like doing is I like using a black as my darkest tone. I use a kind of greeny tone, and it will be a little bit darker than what's depicted here in the final image, but this is just to give an idea. It's not the finished work, it's obviously a sketch towards the work. So I use a greeny tone as my mid-tone, and then I have the white as the lightest tone. The pink I'm not using really as part of that tone story to talk about the shape and form of objects. I'm using it as an accent color. It just makes things feel a bit more vibrant to have that third color in there, and it lets me tell a different kind of story. You will also note that the green and the pink are complementary colors. So that means that the pink is like a softened version of red, so it's just red and white. The green is yellow and blue, and so there's kind of the full color spectrum between the two colors displayed, and that means they contrast off each other in a way that's really pleasing to the eye. In terms of what the design is about, recently I've been looking at illuminated manuscripts. While I've been sitting here bookbinding, I've been listening to lectures and videos about the history of illuminated manuscripts from the medieval period, and I have kind of borrowed their layout for this design. So I've got a dark kind of square that's the main image, and then I'm making use of an offset border around it. And that's the composition. I'm going to change a few things in the composition when I move it onto the block in order to carve it for lino printing. For example, this figure will move down to the bottom because I think having that as like the standing or ground line makes the image feel a little bit more readable. You might also notice if you look very closely that I have made some notes around the outside border of the image for how I'm going to translate this to lino. So something like the dandelion here, it's kind of tough for me to draw out exactly how I want it to look in lino because I'm going to be making use of the fact that I'm carving away the lightest tone. And while I could sit here and I could paint, I could make it the dark color and then I could white out the area, I find that that gets a little bit messy in the design process, and I can just get it to the stage where it's the form, and then I can make myself a note for how I want it to be translated into lino, and that can get me where I need to be. Another thing I get asked about in terms of designing for linocut print is people will say something like, I don't draw, like I don't like to draw, how do I design for linocut? And I have a couple of answers for that, but I'm not sure how satisfying you're going to find these answers. For my linocut practice, for the work that I want to make, it's important that I can draw. It's not like I'm not trying to create something that's realistic. I don't want to create images that look like photos. I want to create things that feel kind of fun and surreal and sort of have a little gothic edge and feel kind of more like storybook illustrations than something that you could find in a photography book. That's not interesting to me at all. So while it's not terribly important to me to be able to draw to a standard that it looks like a photo, I don't actually find that kind of art particularly interesting in the first place. It is important to be able to draw something, to be able to put forms down on the page that create a story, that are readable, that make sense together. And with some level of practice, I don't think that that level of skill is beyond anyone. I think creating a drawing practice, drawing regularly, building up a style, understanding the kind of work you want to make. I made a video in the past that was about finding your artistic style. So if you're interested in watching that, you'll find that in my catalogue of videos. But I think it's really valuable to work on drawing skills if you want to make linocut prints. It is a medium that is very close to drawing. My other answer to that would be it probably is possible to, for example, take photos and edit them to flatten them for printing using a computer program. That's not the kind of work I want to make, but it is possible to make work like that. Another option would be to play with organic kind of patterns, so not sitting down and planning and drawing so much as pulling out dots and shapes and forms in a kind of abstract sense. And I've seen work like this that is really, really cool. So that is definitely something you can do without having traditional drawing skills where you're drawing in a way that's representative of life. Now that I have my design done for this block with some changes that I'm going to make between the design that I've got in my sketchbook. This is one of my sketchbooks that I made. Just as a side note, if you like the sketchbook that I've made, it's the one that I use for myself for all of my design work. I have made several more and I'm going to be listing them on my shop. They should be live when this video goes live, so if you go to the link in the description down below, you should be able to find these books. The covers are linocut printed, the design that I've got on the cover. It took me a long time to carve out this pattern, but it is an example of kind of an abstract pattern that you can make with linocut without being able to draw. It is Coptic bound so that the book lays flat, which is really good for drawing because it doesn't create a bump between the sections, and this sits flush on the table. I've got two paper options. This is the watercolor paper option, so it's good for mixed media, which is what I've been doing. I've also got a sketchbook paper, which is thinner and more appropriate for just drawing. So if you're interested, pop down to the link below. Alright, so I'm just going to quickly take you through the materials I used to get the image from my sketchbook onto the block. So here is my block of lino. Very important. When you transfer something from a sketch onto your block of lino, you need to keep in mind that the image is going to be reversed. So there are lots of different ways to transfer an image. For example, you might do it digitally and you can make it so that you get a digital transfer that kind of sticks or is transferred onto the surface of the block. I don't like doing this because the main version of this uses PVA glue to kind of stick the surface layer of ink onto the paper, and you end up with this kind of film over the block that makes it a little strange to carve and interrupts my carving process. So that is not what I do. What I do is I trace the image. I use baking paper because it's a cheap dupe for tracing paper. And then when I've traced the image, I put that down face down and I rub on the back, and that reverses the image. It'll make sense as I show you. Then once I've done that using lead pencil, I then go over the image using ballpoint pen. This is my favorite ballpoint pen. This is what I like to use. It does transfer a little bit when you print the first layers of the block, which is always worth keeping in mind. So you want to make sure that you're cautiously using it to depict largely what's going to be on the later layers of the block. But it does withstand the printing process and it does stay on the block between layers, which makes it a lot easier to do a reduction and keep carving down. I also use colored pencils to outline the other layers of the block. So I use the colors that I'm actually using, and that enables me to work out what I'm doing more easily. So there's the green for the greeny color and a pink for the pinky color. When I've used colored pencil in that way, or if I'm using a lot of lead pencil, I give it a spray with some fixing spray just to make sure that the layer of pencil on the block isn't going to smudge too much while I'm carving, because you do kind of rub your hand along the surface of the block quite a lot in the carving process. Okay, so it's the next day. I have now finished transferring my sketch to the block. So here's the block. It probably looks a little bit scribbly to you, but it definitely maps out for me. I'm trying to make it focus. It definitely maps out a clear understanding for me about what I'm going to need to know when I'm carving. So if we compare it to the sketch, you can see that obviously it's mirrored, so when I print the block it'll come out looking like this again. You can see that I've made some changes, for example, to the flowers in the border here, and to the middle I've lowered this figure as I said I was going to do, but otherwise it's fairly consistent with the sketch that I made. So some final thoughts in terms of things you need to be thinking about when you're designing for linocut printing. One of the things is to consider what shapes you're going to feel comfortable cutting, both in terms of your skill level and in terms of the tools that you have available. If you're interested in seeing the tools that I use, check out one of my tools tour videos where I go over the tools that I have and how I use them. You'll notice that this block is fairly complex. It's got a lot of complex shapes. It's going to take me quite a long time to carve out, especially the border, because it's just a fairly complex block. But I feel pretty confident with where I'm at with my linocut carving and the tools that I've got, that I'm going to be able to achieve that more or less. There might be some last minute changes where I'm going to have to think on my feet if I make any kind of error, and that is another thing that happens when you're making something where you can't go back, like you can't erase, you can't undo. Linocut is such a prime example of a technique like that. Once you've cut away the block, you really can't undo it. There are some cases where you can cut out what you've done and put in a new piece, but the way that this block is laid out, there's very few places that I would be able to do a fix like that. So it really is get it right the first time, or change what you're doing a little bit. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you would like more art making, lino printing, bookbinding content, please subscribe to my channel. I put up new videos every week. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.